Hey, Cardinal family. Last week I talked to you about a book that was probably an unconventional recommendation from an education perspective, though Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do means a lot to me. It might not to you. So this week I wanted to talk to you about a perspective I gained from probably a more conventional book. It's called Teaching with Poverty in Mind. It's by a guy named Eric Jensen. I was actually looking for it on that bookshelf back there, but two things about my bookshelf. I know there is a Dewey Decimal System, but there's no logic to how I organize that, and I'm also notorious for loaning out books and not really keeping track of where they are. In fact, I'm still waiting for a book to come back from a middle school librarian of all people from about a decade ago. Anyway, um, here's why I'm thinking about this book, Teaching with Poverty in Mind. On Wednesday of this week, Dr. McDowell and I had our ESSA monitoring review with the Nebraska Department of Education, which sounds kind of ominous, but really we work with great people down there. Dottie and Kathy and Ann are awesome at making sure that we are making the most out of our title funds that we receive from the federal government so that it has the greatest impact for our staff and students. So that meeting with NDE is not a gotcha. It is a, hey, what can we do best? What's the most efficient way to do this? What's the most effective way to do this? So it was a long meeting. We met from like 9 in the morning till noon, all on Zoom. You guys know how that goes. And it was really good. But one of the things that we talked about with some frequency, a meaningful amount of time, was serving our populations that are subject to poverty. Um, it's just the nature of the beast when we're talking about title funding. And in doing that, I was reminded about a book that had a really big impact on me. I'll mention again, Teaching with Poverty in Mind by Eric Jensen. And what I love about this book is it talks about how some of the impacts of poverty actually impact brain development on students. So I'm going to give you one example that I would love for you to just take this perspective and realize it with the students that we work with. This isn't a specific strategy. It's just, hey, Sam realized this a long time ago and made a big difference for him, and I hope it makes a difference for you. So one of the things Eric talks about in that book, Teaching with Poverty in Mind, is how the chronic and acute stress that a child living in a poverty situation experiences can impact their brain development and make it so that we maybe assume they have some things that they don't. I'm going to get more specific on that. I love that he talks about chronic and acute stress, and I want to talk about what those two things are. So, chronic stress means that ongoing stress that a child is more likely to experience in a poverty home on a daily basis. Um, if we have a child living in a home where there's poverty and on a daily basis, how much food there is going to be as a concern, that is an example of chronic stress. If they are worried on a daily basis, is the power going to be on? That's an example of chronic stress. Are they worried about on a daily basis? Am I going to be able to see my parents, either one of them, or are they going to have to work overtime to get caught up and they don't know when they're going to see mom and dad again on a daily basis? Those are examples of chronic stress. If you are a child living in a poverty circumstance, you're more likely to experience that. Number two, Eric talks about acute stress. Those are those situations where all of a sudden a child finds themselves in panic or crisis mode. When the sirens and the blue lights go off and there's people in the house they don't recognize and they have badges or they have uniforms or they're driving an ambulance. If you are a child living in a poverty circumstance, you are more likely to experience those acute stress situations. So, again, the frequency in which that chronic and acute stress occurs is more likely for poverty homes. But here's what's really trippy, that impacts brain development. A specific example Eric Jensen gives in the book is empathy is kind of a thing that most people just develop. If you've raised your own children, you have seen them go from that totally toddler self-centered to being able to understand how other people feel and empathize with situations. That stress, that chronic and acute stress, which is more likely to be experienced by a child living in poverty, impedes that empathy development. So if, and this is where, This was a big realization for me as a teacher, as a principal, and working with teachers that took care of students that were more likely to be subject to poverty. Man, if there is something a kid should have that's just a natural part of cognitive development, and it is not abundantly clear why they don't have it, it's like, why do you not feel bad about this? Why do you not understand why this other person feels bad about it? We tend to get frustrated and we tend to just go to consequences. And one of the things that Eric talks about in Teaching with Poverty in Mind is if you have a child that comes from a poverty circumstance that has a lack of empathy, it's not because that kid did anything wrong. It's because circumstances did not allow that to develop in a normal capacity. And now we need to figure out how to teach it. We need to figure out how to teach empathy, which is a thing that we can do. So I'm not really asking you to do anything different this time. I'm not really giving you a strategy. I'm just giving you a perspective and a heads up that if we are working with students who come from poverty circumstances, which we are, and if they have experienced a higher frequency of that chronic and acute stress, which they probably have, there might be things such as empathy, which naturally develop that did not develop as they should. It's a great time for us to exhibit some patience in those circumstances and take a pause and figure out, all right, what is it we need to do? How can we teach those things? I don't have all those answers for you right now, but it's one of the things that's on my radar for professional development as we move forward. By the way, if you want to hook up with that book, Teaching with Poverty in Mind, it's an easy find on Amazon. If you Google it, that'll be the first thing that pops up. Again, if you asked, hey, Sam, can I borrow a copy? I could loan it to one of you if I could have found it, but I can't. So anyway, check that out. It was a kind of a game changer for me when it came to working with students that come from that at-risk segment, which some of the people we take care of. All right, that's all I have, Cardinal family. Hope you didn't have any big side effects from the vaccine if you had that opportunity. And yeah, we'll just keep trucking. Take care.